Hello, everybody. I wanted to pop on in here and do a live stream because I saw a really juicy question pop up on our feed in the private Facebook group on attachment in adult relationships. And I felt compelled to respond to it because in some ways I personally relate to this. And also in other ways, I feel like this is something that causes a lot of people to experience confusion around where and why they do the things that they do. And it also speaks to the contexts in which we understand and perceive ourselves. So it's a long question, so I'm not going to read the entire thing, but I do want to point out the parts that stood out to me and the parts that I really want to speak to. So this individual says that they suspect for a long time that they might be avoidant or anxious avoidant because they've read the list of characteristics and they feel like it has hit home for them, but they struggle with not blaming themselves for the way they've turned out because they feel like they've been very fortunate in life. Okay, so the parents provided for them financially. There was no physical, sexual, and or otherwise tangible abuse or neglect. Overall, this person experienced their parents as loving and well-meaning. However, particularly when it came to this person's mother, they felt like they would be more present for their mother than their mother was present for them emotionally. If she would express her feelings, then it seems like the mom would feel as if she would be at a loss for what to do, and then would express being a failure as a mom for not being able to help out. Also describe the father as being perhaps emotionally abusive in the terms of being kind of controlling, condescending, and reactive, but not knowing if that's a valid assessment. Struggling to feel attachment or emotional connection to the parents, and wondering if it's valid for this person to claim emotional neglect, worrying that that would make this person ungrateful because there's no tangible trauma in their life. So what immediately comes up for several things come up for me, but what immediately comes up for me is that it may not, when we think about trauma, okay, there's this common perception that trauma has to be this severe event, right? And now in the literature, that's called big T trauma. So like something awful, like physical abuse, sexual abuse, alcohol abuse, or drug abuse in the home, severe neglect, like not eating for days, or parents not coming home for nights on end, or, things like that. Rape or natural disaster, or, undue separations, being taken away from the home, like big sort of catastrophic things, right? And even things that are like that are chronic would be considered, chronic. Most people would struggle with the results of chronic trauma. Now that's big T trauma, okay? But perhaps less understood and widely recognized is little t trauma. And this language I'm taking from Bessel van der Kolk. So he's got a trauma institute in Boston area. If you don't know it, I'd recommend checking out anything by Bessel van der Kolk and developmental trauma, okay? So now developmental trauma is more like when there are instances as children where we want to play, we want to explore, we want to be messy. We don't want to do things according to the rules, right? And if we're not given enough flexible space within which to explore those things, that is in fact a trauma. It's a trauma to your emotional self. It's a trauma to your inner being. So let me give you an example. Like you could be a young child and you tie a blanket around your neck, and you set up some pillows around the room, and you start jumping from the couch to the pillows to the table, like, look at me, I'm Superman, look at me go, right? And so in that moment, what's happening is the child is exploring that inner space. They're playing with imagination and creativity, and they're also experimenting with that transitional space between the reality of their inner fantasies and their inner workings of their mind, their ability to think about creative things and to abstract, and then how it's butting up against the real world. I think it was Kohut who talked about this as being a phase of normal narcissism, and that through optimal frustrations, the child learns just through interactions with the world over time, what is quote unquote realistic and what is not. What are their capacities and what is beyond their physical abilities, right? And so the idea is that in that moment, a parent can react in any number of ways. There's a lot of ways a parent could react, but let's just give you two ends of the spectrum. So on one end of the spectrum, we have a parent who says, "Hey, look at you, Superman. Look at you go. Wow, you're so strong," right? And then on the other end of that spectrum, we have, "What are you doing? Shut up. Sit down, take that off. You're getting dirt on my furniture. You're going to drag it across the rug. I just cleaned up this apartment. What are you thinking?" Okay. Now, we're all human. And as a parent, if we just clean the apartment and we get upset when we see that and it happens once or twice, you're not going to ruin your child for life. But if that's your disposition all day, every day, if that's how you respond to normal developmental processes of a child, then that creates little t traumas. Because what happens in that moment is a child receives like a jolt of anxiety because their primary attachment figure, the person they love and honor and respect as essentially like the omnipotent force in their life that they have given all authority and handed over surrender of all authority and belief in, suddenly is chastising them for exploring whatever that inner process was, that imaginative, creative, flexible, amorphous internal process might have been. And so they get this like jolt of anxiety, and then they're like, oh, and it creates a split or a severance in that moment where it's like, oh, that part of me is not acceptable. And so anytime, and there's any number of occasions throughout childhood where similar situations occur. You're in school and you're playing and you're talking with some friends about something, and the teacher says, "Stop talking, sit down, sit up straight in these rows, in these uncomfortable, hard chairs, and just pay attention." Right? So whatever those inner processes, we get it at home, we get it in school, we get it at work, right? It's the same message over and over and over and over again. And so we get this severance that occurs between who we are, that inner explorative, imaginative self, and the world around us. And so if you receive that in your family of origin, that creates an emotional split. And we deal with it in different ways. We might become anxiously striving to acquire and or rise to the standards of the people around us so that they approve of us, right? So that they see that we're sitting still and quietly in our seat, and they'll like us and they'll pay us attention and they'll love us and they won't leave us or abandon us, right? And so then maybe they won't see the bad person who tracked the dirt in the room, right? Because that person's not going to get loved. And so you can't be that person and you can't explore that. Okay. But that child wasn't beaten. That child wasn't sexually abused. The child wasn't neglected. The parents paid for their education. They had high hopes for this child. They were going to do good things with their life. Education was important, right? They were there. Okay. So the purpose of this is not to blame our parents. Our parents have tools, and whatever those tools are, I believe most people do the best with whatever tools they have. Okay. But it doesn't mean that you don't have a right, that it's not valid for you to see and experience and to know that you had an experience of something in that moment, that you had a right to explore that inner space. And if you didn't have the opportunity to do it as a child, now it's your job, being the authority of your own life, to create that space. You have to kind of reparent that child that's kind of waiting inside of you to finally have the opportunity to put on that cape and dance around the room, right? But if you've got that internalized parent, if you've taken that voice and you've internalized it, and every time there's a piece of you that's like, oh, let's do it, and then the opposite voice that's now inside your head over years and years and years of conditioning responds by saying, no, that's childish, that's going to ruin the furniture, right? Then you're doing it to yourself, right? Now you're doing it to yourself. And so blame is useful. Blame can be really useful, because if you're stuck in that cycle where you're doing it to yourself all the time, blame your parents. It might be time for you to start blaming your parents, because that's what's going to help shift that hamster wheel, because you got to get it out of you. right? So blame in that instance is going to help you get off that hamster wheel. You're looking for the next relieving thought, right? You're looking for the next relieving construct, cognitive structure that's going to allow you to move past it, okay? And so maybe blame is the first place to start, because maybe then you will give yourself permission. You will give yourself permission to have your feelings about it, to be like, you know what, maybe dad did pay for my education and maybe he meant well, but he was also controlling and condescending and reactive. And it was kind of irresponsible to be that way when it's not just that you need to keep a child's belly full. It's not just that you need to keep a roof over a child's head. It's not just that you need to try to create opportunities for them to go to the best schools, right? It's also that child has an emotional, mental, and spiritual life. And those things are equally important. And so part of it too is adopting the understanding that that is a value that is really important. Okay? And sometimes you go through self-blame, right? You're just I don't have a right to say that about my parents, like, because you're still protecting the parent. You're still protecting the parent because as a child, we have to idealize and protect our parents. We have to adopt these stories that my childhood was great. My childhood was awesome. My parents were awesome. They cared for me. They had their flaws, but if that's and what's interesting is sometimes we come back full circle to that narrative, but you can't skip the journey, okay? If that's the narrative you have, but it's glossing over all of these feelings that you're not allowing yourself to have because you have to believe that your childhood was good, because if you acknowledge anything else, then the construct of the identity that you've created for yourself is going to crumble. And then we're going to lose control, or the underneath that there's the fear that who I really am is unworthy of love, and if I allow that to come out, then no one's going to love me, or everyone's going to leave me, or whatever it is, right? Or it's going to be too much. I'm going to be too intense for someone. Okay, so that's kind of one end of the stick, right? So you might start with beating yourself up, then maybe you move to blaming your parents, and this is all part of the process, and getting angry and getting mad, right? And then sometimes we move from blame to anger, right? And so we have to act that out somehow. And then we might move into frustration, okay? So we start to feel frustrated, but then the frustration is kind of motivating, because you're like, well, I don't want this to be the thing anymore, right? And then you get kind of sick of the angry, blaming, frustrated feelings, and you're like, okay, I'm ready to whatever it is, whatever it was, I'm coming to a place of understanding and insight around that now. I understand my parents had what tools they had, and I'm actually ready to recognize what tools they didn't have. And I'm willing to acknowledge that it doesn't make them terrible people. It just makes them products of what they've allowed themselves to become products of, right? And now I have choices about what I'm going to allow myself to become a product of, okay? So you have every right to your feelings. You have every right. Am I ungrateful? Be ungrateful. Be ungrateful. Sometimes you got to be ungrateful. Sometimes, if that's going to release you from the bondage of that self-punishment. Okay? And you know what? That mechanism of you're not grateful, right? That's also a mechanism of control. Because another thing that was mentioned in this question was that the mother expressing, oh, I'm such a failure of my mother, I don't know how to help you, and blah, blah, blah. What happens in that moment is she's taken away your right to have the uncomfortable feelings. She's like, oh, you're uncomfortable? I am going to be twice as uncomfortable as you, so that you have to take care of me instead, so that I don't have to feel like I'm a failure of a mother anymore. Okay, this is one that I know personally. Having an upset feeling, oh, I'm a terrible mother. Now I'm not allowed to have upset feelings anymore because I have to convince you that you are not a terrible mother. Right? Other people do this too. There's other instances in relationships where this kind of mechanism occurs, where someone has done something that is kind of thoughtless or disrespectful, and they'll come to you like it's time to talk about it or to confront it. And then they come to you and they're so apologetic. oh, don't, I know, it was awful. I feel so bad about it. It was so terrible of me. How can I make it up to you? Whatever it is, I'll do it. I feel so bad. Oh my God. Whatever it is, I'll do it. Feel so terrible about it. And then in that, or they're like beating themselves up about it, right? Like they're so bereft. And now you're taking care of them, and you don't have any right to your anger or to your experience of feeling like someone has disrespected you, or feeling as if someone, didn't acknowledge the way that was going to affect you, right? Now they're going to punish themselves enough so that you don't have a right to your feelings, because they're already doing the work for you, right? And so you're kind of left with this sense of like, where do I go with that? Right? He's already they're already beating themselves up so much. Like, I don't want to add to the pile. And so then you're left with it, right? So I guess the point that I want to emphasize here is that you want to be aware of where you're not giving yourself permission. It's like, so this question in particular struck me because it felt like this person's right on the edge. They're like right on the edge of starting to see things and starting to understand things. And it's kicking up this underlying narrative, which is saying, don't listen. You had a great life. No. You'd be ungrateful if you allowed yourself to see these things, right? You don't have a right to that. And that's what happens in those mechanisms that we just described. Parents that are controlling or condescending or reactive and like tell you to split off a part of yourself because you're ruining something in their neatly organized world, right? Or that they become so enmeshed with you where it's not like your parents are there for you, but you tend to be there for your parents when it comes to the emotional life, right? And so this person mentions they're struggling to feel an attachment to either of them, and I don't blame you, because it sounds like either one parent is too reactive and then the other becomes enmeshed with you. And so it's dangerous. Those are emotionally dangerous relationships. And the thing that what you learn how to do with those relationships is to cut them off. I used to remark when I was an adolescent, I would remark to people all the time, I don't know what you mean when you say you miss people. I never felt like I missed anyone. And I had parents living in 2 different states. I was like, I don't know what you mean. What do you mean miss someone? They're there. You know where they are. You know you'll see them in a couple of months. What does it mean to miss someone? You're alive. They're not dead. What does that mean? I totally connect with that. And I think it's because those relationships are so invasive, or they've been experienced in such a way that your feelings, you're robbed of your ability to have that expression and to hold it and to have the other person allow you to have that, right? And that's the anxious avoidant dynamic. And so the other thing that happens with enmeshed parents is like, sometimes if one parent's emotionally distant or too controlling or whatever, then the other kind of compensates by being, let's say, too well-meaning or too there, and then they let the boundaries get blurred, and then it's like your parent's kind of like your friend, and then that responsibility becomes blurred, and we become a little parentified sometimes in the process, and then it's like you can't rail against them in the same way because you're afraid that they're going to shatter, right? Okay, so that's probably enough to make my point on that. But the recommendation here is, if any of this has resonated for you, or you find yourself wondering, why am I like this? Because it seems like I had a good childhood. I want you to allow yourself to kind of be sort of, what's the expression? I want you to reverse engineer it. Reverse engineer it a little bit. And like to take a look at, well, what are the symptoms that I'm experiencing now? Who are the partners that I'm calling into my life? And what is that saying about where I am and where I've been? Like, so for example, I had another client message me saying, I'm a secure person, but my partner's avoidant. And, I always make sure that I was respecting them. I was always mindful of their space. I was always giving them everything that they want. But then when they broke up with me, I didn't understand what that meant, and I fell into a deep depression, and I lost my soulmate. Okay. In that question alone, something is suggesting to me that this person may not be as secure as they perceive themselves to be. But it's kind of like trying to explain water to a fish that is swimming in it. Okay, so if you want to take a look, if you are experiencing these kind of extreme reactions to a relationship, you have to start thinking about, what is this actually mirroring for me? Because even like the first part, I was always aware of it and I was honoring their space and blah, 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 suggests that there was something this person was doing to bend and twist and mold themselves to accommodate the other. Okay, so that is more of an anxious quality, right? Where you are morphing yourself to benefit the other. Incidentally, avoidants do this too, which is why they become avoidant. Because they know within themselves that sometimes when they get around someone who's anxious, because typically anxious people have this unquenchable thirst, sometimes avoidants have a tendency to slip into it. And that's sort of where that initial high and infatuation period comes in, because they want to please. Okay, and they allow for the fantasy for a while until they hit a point where they realize that the hunger is never really going to be sated and nothing they ever do is really going to be enough, and that their partner is not really going to respect their boundaries because they view it as a separation, or because they become fearful that they're going to be abandoned. And so then they up their protest behaviors. And if you want to know about the protest behaviors, you can check out my other video on that. So then the avoidance triggers get snapped and they start doing their deactivating strategies. So then they start finding all the flaws in their partner rather than being able to sit with it until, the deactivating or the activating strategies cool off. And so it's just like this vicious cycle, right? So if you're finding that in your relationships, a bit of this vicious cycle is popping up, rather than focusing on the other, like analyzing and picking apart the other, if you need to do that first, go ahead and do that first. But then take that blueprint and turn it around on yourself. Turn it around on yourself and be like, so what does this blueprint, how is this indicating something to me about where I'm abandoning myself? What is this indicating to me about where I am needing nourishment, where I am needing love, where I am needing to connect with that inner child that was forced to sit still instead of fly around the room? What parts of yourself need to put on that cape and fly around in order to feel safe and secure in your relationship, or to stop the people pleasing that's going to lead to resentment, that's going to make you bolt, right? Because it's the avoidance responsibility to establish boundaries where they need to and to hold them. And then equally, it's the anxious person's responsibility to hold a little bit back, right? I mean, actually, if you've watched this show, I think avoidance and anxiety is basically the same mechanism. It just manifests in different ways. But it's about, boundaries ultimately. But this video is getting long. I could go on forever about this, so I'll just wrap it up. But basically, I wanted to say that if you are wondering if there's no, discernible trauma in your history, if you feel like, I don't know where this is coming from, I want you to research developmental trauma, right? I want you to take a look into little t traumas, because that's really going to help you, okay? And if you're interested in learning a lot more about this, I do have an online course. It's called Healing Attachment Wounds, and I have added a bonus offer to that course if you purchase it now. It's like, I have another course. It's called Ignite Your Love Light. That's a 5-day course. And that one I've knocked 60% off the price if you purchase Healing Attachment Wounds this month. So I'm going to put a link to that in the caption of this video. You can find links to it throughout the feed here. If any of this resonates with you, and anything comes up, if you like this video, just give me a like in the button below. If you were watching this on YouTube, give me a subscribe. And also, if you have more questions, let me know those as well, because that allows me to create more content like this. So thank you for watching, and I look forward to reading your feedback.